Hello, I want to open up this lecture with a question. You can categorize literature in general in different types. There's realistic historical writing, there's fictional, science fictional writing. If I would ask you, how would you categorize biblical writing? Would you consider it historical, realistic writing, or more fictional, science fictional? I would categorize it as historical, realistic writing. I think the Torah in general wants to present itself as a realistic writing, events taking place at specific times and specific places. But I think perhaps the most prominent proof that we are talking about realistic writing is the presence of miracles. This may sound a little paradoxical. Miracles, that makes it realistic? And I say yes, and I'll explain. In science fiction, let's take Harry Potter, okay? Are there miracles? Not really. I mean, everything's magical, right? You can fly on a broomstick and you can disappear, right? Animals that can create magical events, etc. Because it's a magical kingdom, it's science fiction. However, with regard to the Bible, when something breaks the rules of nature, seems to be extraordinary, then it will be considered a miracle. It'll be presented as a miracle. So if water comes out of a rock to quench the thirst of the people, that'll be described as a miracle. Or if God splits the sea, that'll be a miracle. There is a staff, but that's a miracle. It's not a magic trick. It's not part of conception of real powers within nature. Rather, this is God intervening in nature. All this is true in general for the Bible. However, when relating to our story, the story of the Garden of Eden, there seems to be certain aberrations. For one, I don't know about you, but I'm not used to meeting talking snakes. Maybe Harry Potter can talk to a snake, right? But in our appreciation of the world, snakes don't talk and communicate, never mind in a sophisticated manner, with people. Do you know of another animal that talks in the Bible? Oh, you do? Yes, there is that case of the talking donkey, Bilam's donkey that talks, Atono shel Bilam. Bilam was the prophet invited by Balak, the king of Moab, in the book of Numbers to curse the Jewish people. And he eventually gets approval by God to go with the messengers of Balak. But on the way, suddenly the donkey starts giving trouble, right? And doesn't move, eventually sits down, and Bilam, the prophet, starts striking his donkey. And suddenly the donkey opens its mouth and asks, "Why are you hitting me? I'm your loyal donkey." So you can say, hey, this is not the only case where we have a talking animal. Well, my response to that would be, indeed so, however, with one difference. With the case of the talking donkey, Bilam's talking donkey, the text explicitly states, and I'll quote it in Hebrew and then translate, Vaiftach Hashem et pi ha'aton, and God opened the mouth of the donkey, and she began to talk, right? So there it is indeed described as a miracle with divine intervention. What's odd about our case is that it's not described as a miracle, the fact that the donkey is talking. Rather, it's described as a natural kind of event. Here, let's take a look at the text. We'll share screen and see. Okay, how has he described the snake? So the serpent was more subtle, more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, he starts speaking because he was the most cunning of creatures created. So there's a snake that's very smart, intelligent, and starts speaking with the woman. So hence, this seems to be described as an occurrence. We're not surprised. Okay, this is a smart snake and he's talking. It's not like an intervention. This is a snake that existed and spoke all the time. It was a smart snake, serpent. How are we to view this? This seems to break, right, the rules of, historical, realistic type of writing, right? That's one question. How do we approach a talking snake? And number two, there's something else that seems to be quite peculiar in our story of the Garden of Eden. We have these magical fruit trees, right? A fruit tree that if you eat from it, suddenly your intelligence, your IQ jumps, right? And people suddenly are aware and they know how to distinguish between good and evil, etc. So this seems to be a kind of magical food, right? Do we have magical foods anywhere else in the Bible? So you'll probably say, hey, of course, we got the manna that the Israelites were given in the desert. And we've got water that was given to Israelites, right, via miracles in the desert. So the difference is obvious. In those cases, the food itself seems to be normal food. It's not that anybody who ate from the manna suddenly had, special powers they didn't have before. God brings the food in a miraculous way, but the food itself seems to be normal. There are, of course, homiletic interpretations that gave the manna like the possibility of having any taste you imagine, but that's according to the Midrash, the homiletical interpretation. According to the simple reading, it had a sweet taste, right? But nothing powerful and magical in the food given to the Israelites. However, in our case, we seem to have a special food, right, that does transform the humans who eat it. So that is one question that we have to grapple with. How do we view this story of the Garden of Eden in light of the fact that we have a talking snake and we have a magical fruit tree? Seems to suit more like mythological Greek type of mythology more than our typical biblical narrative. So is the Bible really realistic historical, or should we categorize it more as mythological? If we accept the premise that it, like I presented, that it is primarily historical, realistic type of writing, then we have to grapple with the aberrations that we find in our story of the Garden of Eden. And of course, we're not the first to raise this question. This question was already raised earlier by, early Jewish commentators, and amongst them, Rasag. Rasag is an acronym for Rav Saadia Gaon, Rabbi Saadia Gaon, who lived in the 10th century, primarily in Egypt. He's a very important figure. You can say to a large extent he's the father of Jewish interpretation, the beginning of middle-aged Jewish commentaries. He's called a Gaon. That was a title for a certain period of Babylon, mostly Babylonian scholars, right, after the Talmudic age. However, he's more, I think, as far as his characteristics, more related to the Middle Age period. And to a large extent, he's first in commentary as well as philosophy. He also wrote Jewish philosophy books, an important figure. He wrote in Arabic, but his writings have been translated, those that have been found. He had a translation to Arabic of the Torah, which now has been translated back into Hebrew, because every translation is an interpretation. And he also had a longer interpretation. And we found his longer interpretation to Genesis. And there he has a very fascinating discussion of the snake. And he simply goes against the possibility of explaining the snake allegorically. He says, I know that there are those who want to say that the snake is not really a snake. it represents something else. It's not just it's not a snake. It's a metaphor. The snake is a metaphor for something else. And then he basically polemicizes and argues against that. And he says, I know why you wanted to explain that, because you have trouble in grappling with a talking snake. However, if you start explaining the Torah allegorically, if you're going to say the snake is an allegory, you're going to have to say that the snake's punishment is an allegory, because the snake isn't really a snake, so his punishment must also be an allegory. And if the punishment of the snake is an allegory, then perhaps all the punishments are allegories. And then if you say that the punishments are allegories, perhaps the characters are allegories, perhaps the Garden of Eden is an allegory, perhaps all of Genesis is an allegory. You'll end up neutralizing anything that has to do with factuality and say everything's just a metaphor, it's just symbolic. And therefore he rejects, he says this is a Pandora's box. If you start interpreting allegorically, saying that the Torah is a metaphor for other things, representing other things, you'll end up undoing the whole Torah. So how will he grapple with a talking snake? His solution is that the snake was actually created by God or transformed by God and made into a more intelligent creature. In other words, God intervened and gave the snake powers for the purpose of testing man. And when the snake perhaps overstepped its boundaries and did too much of what it was supposed to do, then it was also punished. But this was a snake that was given powers, according to Rasag, to test man. It's not a metaphor. It was a snake that was given powers and made like a human, and hence it could be punished. So this is a fine solution by Rabbi Saadia Gaon, but I have one problem with it, and that is that the text doesn't say so. The text didn't say that God intervened and gave the snake intelligence. That Rasag is adding himself. Had the text said that God gave the snake intelligence, I wouldn't have a question. Just like he opened the mouth of Bilam's donkey, he could open the mouth of the snake. But there is no mention in text that God opened the mouth of the snake. No, the snake was very cunning, and it began to speak with Eve. So for that reason, I think that this suggestion does not fit the text, doesn't fit the pshat. It's an attempt to overcome a problem, but I cannot consider it to be pshat. In other words, I cannot consider it to fit the simple meaning of the text. What is clear is that Rasag is opposed to allegorical interpretations. Another fascinating grappling with this question appears in the Zohar. The Zohar is the primary source of the mystical interpretations to the Torah, right? According to, say, common folk understandings, they attribute it to very early period to the Tana, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, famous Tana. According to most scholars, the Zohar itself, the book itself, is later and is probably originating from the area of Sfarad, of Spain, in the Middle Ages. In any event, we find in the Zohar the following disagreement with regard to the understanding of the snake. Take a look. I'm translated here as the original Hebrew here. It's actually Aramaic, and this is a translation. So on the snake, it's on page 35b. Rabbi Isaac said, this is the evil inclination. The translation of Yetzer Hara, the Yetzer Hara in Hebrew, the evil inclination. This is fascinating. Rabbi Isaac is saying that the snake is actually representative of the evil inclination within the human. In other words, when the snake is speaking, it's actually an internal voice within Eve. It's her evil inclination trying to, right, convince her to eat, to transgress the command. Second opinion, Rabbi Judah said a real snake. Rabbi Judah disagrees. He says, Nachash mamash in the Hebrew, no, a real snake. So we have here two opinions, Rabbi Isaac and Rabbi Judah. What are they arguing about? So on face value, they're arguing exactly on the point that was brought up by Rasag. Is it legitimate to interpret the Torah allegorically? Rabbi Judah, the second opinion, agrees with Rasag and says, no, don't go allegorically. If it says a snake, there's a snake. While Rabbi Isaac apparently is willing to adopt an allegorical approach and say there is no snake. This talking snake is actually an internal voice within Eve, right? On a deeper level, there might also be a philosophical, not only a methodological disagreement here. They may be arguing about the root of evil and its relation to man. Is man evil? So would Rabbi Isaac claim there is an evil inclination within man, while Rabbi Judah may hold that no, man is actually good by his nature. He's of goodness. He was created of goodness. And if there's any evil, it's a negative external, right, influence upon man. In any event, Rabbi Isaac's position opens the possibility of an allegorical understanding of the snake. And if we do adopt such an approach, that would neutralize the problem of a talking snake. But you have to make a decision. Are you in agreement with an allegorical possibility of interpretation, as Rabbi Isaac, or do you agree with Rabbi Judah and Rabbi Saadia Gaon, who reject an allegorical possibility of interpretation? This is a fundamental question in exegesis, in interpretation of biblical exegesis, biblical interpretation, right? The tradition of allegorical interpretation is actually quite old. In fact, it's very common in early Christian commentaries. The church fathers were prone to interpret the text allegorically, and for good reason, right? Because once with Christianity, they stopped keeping the different commandments. So the question is, okay, so what's the value of the Torah and all its commandments if you don't keep the commandments? And the answer was, oh, it has educational, moral value if you interpret it allegorically, not to take it literally. So for example, if the Torah says you don't eat pork, right? So the Christians will say, it's not talking really about pork. You can eat pork, as they do. The idea is that you have to stay away from filthy things. So you still have what to learn from this command. You interpret it in an allegorical way, right? So the early church fathers were prone to allegorical interpretation, but in truth, they're not the originators. You could say the father of allegorical interpretation to the Bible is a certain Hellenistic Jew who lived pretty much parallel to the time of Jesus, and saying in the beginnings, right, before the first century, towards the end of the first century BC, and a little after into the first century of the Common Era. And this Jew was Philo of Alexandria. You may have heard of him. Philo of Alexandria, a very important figure who wrote in Greek in Egypt, Alexandria, in a Hellenistic framework. There was a large Hellenized community. For that reason, the Bible was also translated into Greek. That served as the basis for the later Christian Bible, which was from the Greek, was translated into the Latin, and so forth. And so this was originally used by Jews, and Philo, a Jew in Alexandria, has a lengthy interpretation in which he often, right, gives allegorical, right, understandings to many of the things brought in the Bible, right? And for that reason, he's an important figure also in the tradition of Christian interpretations of the Bible, right? Because he may be viewed as a source for many of the early allegorical interpretations. But this was less mainstream in Jewish interpretation. But we could see there is such a position here in the Zohar, the mystical interpretation with Rabbi Isaac. If we look into more mainstream interpretations, if we take, for example, Ibn Ezra, Abraham Ibn Ezra, who was a Jewish commentator from Spain from the 12th century, and he actually writes an introduction to his interpretation where he tries to present his methodology of interpretation. And he uses a kind of a metaphor saying that interpretation is like trying to hit a target. And he says a good interpretation is a bullseye, right? Pretty decent interpretation will hit somewhere in this, on the target. A poor interpretation misses the target. And then he starts delineating different approaches that exist. And in the third approach that he presents, he says it's a way of darkness and they're way out of the target, they're way off target, right? And he's referring to the allegorical approach. He says, they are a mistaken people. In Hebrew, am to'ele vavhem. They are mistaken people, and I think he's calling them a people because he's referring maybe to Christians, to the Christian interpretations that are allegorical. He says, they're wrong in general. They're off target in their interpretations. The Torah is not usually allegorical. But, he says, in a couple of instances, there may be some truth to their interpretations. When things don't make any sense, they're not rational, right? And he even gives an example. One of them is a verse from Deuteronomy. I'll say the Hebrew and then translate it. The verse in Deuteronomy states, "Umaltem et olat levavchem." I'll translate that to, you should circumcise the foreskin of your heart. That's what it says. Umaltem, like Brit Milah, circumcise. Ola, the foreskin of your heart. Now, if we take that verse literally, what we have to do is basically open heart surgery, cut part of the heart. I'm afraid that if we take that verse literally, there will not be too many Jews around, right? Because they will die. It is obvious that that verse has to be taken allegorically. What does it mean? You have to clean your heart from the negative, from the filth, from bad, from evil. You have to cleanse your heart. That's what it means, right? And here it's all a metaphor of circumcising is like cleaning, and the foreskin is representative of something which is impure. You have to take it all out, right? And you have to keep a pure heart. So he says, here's an example. And his second example in that introduction, interestingly enough, is related to the story of the Garden of Eden. He concludes and he says, "Ve'etz hadat sodinam," in the story of the tree of knowledge, a secret is pleasant. In other words, is appropriate. And he's probably referring to an allegorical interpretation. Unfortunately, he didn't give an allegorical interpretation in his commentary, but he believed that there was a place for one. So maybe Ibn Ezra in general is actually in agreement with Rasag that allegory is wrong, is not the correct interpretation. The Torah in general isn't allegorical. However, with regard to the story of the Garden of Eden, perhaps, or at least with regard to the tree of knowledge and perhaps the snake, there he would be apparently in agreement with an allegorical approach. So that's in relation to the snake, but what are we going to do with the tree of knowledge? So here there is also an interesting suggestion proposed in a Midrash, actually a compendium, which is a late compendium. It's not quoted often at all in the commentaries, but it's a fascinating one, and it is called Midrash Tadshe. That's its name, Tadshe, or sometimes also known as the Braita of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. This Midrash, this homiletical interpretation, Midrash Tadshe, that's how it's called, is quoted from about the 12th century in Middle Ages. And there was a really, I think, brilliant suggestion here. This Midrash comes and says, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, he says that the tree of knowledge was a normal tree. It had no powers. It didn't have any, special effect on Adam and Eve. And he gives a lot of evidence for this. For starters, just as far as how the tree is referred to by the characters, he points out that it's not called the tree of knowledge. It's just a tree in the middle of the garden, and therefore, we'll just show it in the text as well. You can see, let's say, for example, when the woman and the snake are talking. So, right, the woman said, what does she answer to the serpent? Of the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God said not to eat, right? So it's just a tree, it's a tree in the middle of the garden, right? That's how it's normally referred to by the characters. Soon I'll explain how he explains its actual name as a tree of knowledge, which appears, only in the words of the narrator, not by the characters themselves. But his additional evidence is that he claims that humans were intelligent before eating from the fruit. How does he prove this? Well, he says for starters, when man's lonely in chapter 2, God creates for him animals. And then what does man do? He gives names to all the animals, right? That was in chapter 2. Now, what does that mean to give a name, right? So giving a name is actually defining, right? Here it says in verse 20, and the man gave names to all cattle, to all fowl, everything, to all the beasts. So man was defining the creatures, giving, identifying them, distinguishing between them, giving them names, and hence man was intelligent. And therefore, his intelligence doesn't come from eating from the fruit. He also cites that Midrash cites verses that describe man as having been created in perfection, in the image of God, in perfection. So he must have been intelligent to begin with. And hence, his wisdom, his intelligence does not come from the fruit. So why was the tree? Why was the fruit called, or the tree called, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? So the suggestion provided by this midrash was that as a consequence of eating from the fruit and transgressing the command, man, Adam and Eve, they were punished, and from now on they also suffer. In other words, up till now they only knew goodness. Because of the transgression, because of the sin and the ensuing punishment, now they know not only goodness, but they also know suffering. So it's the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. In other words, and that's a literal translation, it's a dat tov vara, good and bad, and not in a moral sense, but in an experiential sense. Now they also know suffering, bad. They know, right? They because man now became mortal, and he suffers from sickness and other things. So now, right, man will suffer, and that's why the tree is called, because of its effect, not as a magical effect, but rather as a consequence of the sin and the punishment. Now man will also suffer, right? If we combine Rabbi Isaac, who said that the snake is just an allegory for an evil inclination within Eve, and this Midrash Tadshe that does away with any magical aspect of the fruit tree, then we may be able to cleanse this story of anything that sounds mythological, right? And say there's nothing magical in this story. But of course, that's on condition that you're willing to accept an allegorical approach, something which was not accepted, for example, by Rasag or Rabbi Judah in the Zohar, who disagrees with Rabbi Isaac. So that I leave up to you. You have to decide. Are you willing to take the route of allegorical interpretation or not? As for me, I'll present to you my take. I generally agree that the Torah is non-allegorical, as stated by Rasag. However, with regard to the story of the Garden of Eden, I actually am supportive of an allegorical approach. But my position is going to be quite radical, because I will make a claim that not only is the snake an allegory, the whole story is an allegory. And for this, I will try to present totally new understanding of the story of the Garden of Eden. For your consideration, some of this is based on prior suggestions by other commentators, including even some of the early sages, Jewish sages, who pointed out some correlations, and later commentators, modern commentators. And some of it is my own, so I'll present it to you. And I'll start with the major thesis that the Garden of Eden that was created, right, in the second chapter, God plants the garden and puts man in the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden actually represents the house of God, the temple, or prior to the temple, there was the tabernacle, the Mishkan, described, right, in the book of Exodus, in the second part of the book of Exodus, the Mishkan, the place that God resides in. How do I get to such a wild idea that the Garden of Eden represents the place of God's residence? Well, for starters, we know that God is described there as, walking in the garden. He's present there. If you recall, after the sin, right, in the third chapter, we had the statement that they hide. Why do they hide? Because they heard the voice of the Lord God. That's in verse 8 in chapter 3, walking in the garden. So obviously God is present there in the garden. That's his place. That's where he is, right? Beyond that, if we look at the closing verse of the story, verse 24, when God expels Adam and Eve from the garden, look at the formulation there. We'll first look at the Hebrew and then see the translation. So, Vayigaresh et ha'adam, so he drove out the man. Right? Look at the next word. Vayashken. Vayashken, translated, and he placed. Vayashken mikedem legan Eden, he placed east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim, right? And the flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. So first of all, that word, vayashken, to place, is that same root of Mishkan, the house. That's the term used, the tabernacle, shachan, God's presence. It's interesting. Beyond that, the most blatant connection is, of course, the mention of the cherubim, kruvim. What are they? We're not really certain. They are some angelic type figures with wings, either baby-faced figures or a man and a wife, different suggestions given, but more like angelic, winged, baby-faced creatures, right? These kruvim are mentioned in two places in the Torah. Here, in our story of the Garden of Eden, and in the heart of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the house of God, right? In the Holy of Holies, on top of the Ark of the Covenant, there were in gold, right, these two graven images of golden graven images of these cheruvim, right, which is very surprising, right? But that's what it was. Upon the Holy of Holies, perhaps I'll share with you an image. That's Google image for those who are unfamiliar. Let's try to see if we could find. We'll take a look and try to share with you. Here we go. So this is kind of how it looked. Let's open up and share a picture. I hope you can see it here. Focus. There it is. Okay, do it full screen. That doesn't give me. Let me just do a share here. See the picture, right? These are like the Kruvim, angelic figures on top of the Ark of the Covenant, where there were placed, of course, the tablets, right? You can see other images, this one as well. So these are the Kruvim like images, different interpretations, how they looked. In any event, these Kruvim are mentioned in the Mishkan and here in our story in the Garden of Eden. What else connects between our story and the Mishkan that we get such an idea? So first of all, the tree in its shape, according to some commentators, may be reminiscent of the menorah, right? That was in the Holy of Holies, right? Kind of like a tree-shaped kind of an object. So the trees may kind of be reminiscent of the menorah, which was also in the Holies, right, in the Mishkan. Beyond that, this idea of drawing a connection between the Garden of Eden and the Mishkan may help solve another query or peculiar facet of the story. So if you recall in chapter 2 in the description of the Garden of Eden, so there is an emphasis of metal and gold. Let's take a look in the description of the rivers, the different rivers that flow within the garden. So if you take a look in verse 12, we find here an emphasis on gold being found in that area. And we ask ourselves, what does that have to do with anything, right? Why emphasize gold? Right? Take a look in verse 12 and the name, or verse 11. The name of the first is Pishon, that is in which compass the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. Right, and then it also says there are different special precious stones, and we ask ourselves, what does that have to do with anything? Why is the story describing us gold? Are we treasure hunters? Well, if we ask, what is the most prominent metal in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle? Everything was almost everything was gold, right? Plated gold or pure gold. The menorah was pure gold, as were the kruvim. But a lot of things, the ark, the table, they were plated gold, right? So this is the most prominent metal in the Mishkan. This may be hinted in the description of the Garden of Eden. So that's as far as the metal is, the metal of gold being mentioned here. In addition to the metals, like I said, there are precious stones, right, that are brought. The Even HaShoam, the Bdolach and Even HaShoam. Now, the Even HaShoam here translated, right, here you go, translation of a precious stone, Even HaShoam. Well, the Even HaShoam is actually the most prominent stone mentioned in the attire of the priest in the Mishkan, right? He had the Shoam as one of the 12 precious stones on his breastplate, as well on his shoulder pads on the ephod. He had the Shoham on both sides of his shoulders. So it's interesting. It's not something that appears right in the Torah often, but the Shoham appears here and in the attire of the high priest who was in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. Now, if we say that the Garden of Eden represents the Mishkan, the temple, the house of God, then what shall we say about Adam and Eve. Adam is placed in the garden. Well, here there's something fascinating, because when Adam is placed in the garden, take a look at what is stated as far as his obligations there, right? He was put, God in verse 15, God put Adam in the garden, Vaikach Hashem Elohim et ha'adam, vayenicheu began Eden le'ovda u'leshomra. And the Lord took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden, le'ovda, which I would translate as to work it and to guard it, right? I prefer a better translation of these two words. Le'ovda u'leshomra. La'avod is to work it and to guard it. Now take a look at this combination of verbs, to work, la'avod, and to guard. Interestingly, if we take a look at the description of the function of the priests, in the Mishkan, what were they supposed to do? So let's take a look at the book of Numbers, chapter 3, right? In the description of the Levites, that was the source of the priests. The priests come from the Levites. So we'll do a new share screen here, and we will go to not Genesis, but rather the book of Numbers. Okay. So let's start up from the book of Numbers. We're in chapter 3, and we'll start off from verse 5. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, bring the tribe of Levi near, and set them before Aaron the priest, that they may minister unto him. Now take a look what their job is. And maybe I'll read first the Hebrew, because then we'll see the original language. Veshamru et mishmarto, ואת משמרת כל העדה לפני אוהל מועד, לעבוד את עבודת המשכן, ושמרו את כל כלי אוהל מועד, ואת משמרת בני ישראל, לעבוד את עבודת המשכן. Right, so two in English, right? If we focus on the two key words or roots in this description relating to the function of the Levites, so, right, the source of the priests, there is the word shamar, right? 1, 2, shamru et mishmarto et mishmeret, 3, and then 4, veshamru et mishmeret, 5 times. We have the root to guard, to right? Here they translate as keep, to guard, lishmor, right? To keep his charge, to guard it. And beyond that, the other key word is the word la'avod, right? To work, la'avod et avodat hamishkan, once and twice, right? La'avod et avodat hamishkan in both verses. In other words, the two verbs that describe the role of the Levites, and you can say in general the whole tribe of Levi, including the priests, is to guard and to work. That is exact. Those are a combination of those two words are what's used to describe, right, the function of Adam in the garden, right? He was put there, le'ovda u'leshomra. That's his. Those are his functions, right? What we saw in verse 15, le'ovda u'leshomra, right? I would say to work it and to keep, to guard it. Those are his functions. So we have something which parallels the tabernacle, the house of God, and Adam is like the high priest. Adam and Eve would be like the high priest. Okay. Now within his work, there is of course things that are commandments that he has to perform, and things that are prohibited. And that is exactly what God tells them. And that's the idea of the forbidden tree, right? In the next verse, God tells them in verse 16, Mikol etz hagan achol tochel, right? You may eat from all the trees of the garden. And then there's the prohibition. In other words, this would be parallel to positive commandments, what you may do. And on the flip side, what you may not do, prohibitions. Right? But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat of it, right? So it's what you may do or should do, and what you may not do. We have positive parallels to positive and negative commandments. And now we get to the snake. And in relation to the snake, I will say that I'm in agreement with the Rabbi Isaac that the snake is chosen as a metaphor for your evil impulses, the evil voice within you, right? Trying to convince you to transgress, right? To not keep the commandments. And the snake was used probably because it's low, it's sly, its movements, right? That's how your evil impulses try to convince you into transgressing, into sinning, right? Now, after they sin, what happens? They are aware of their nakedness, and then they cover themselves up with fig leaves. What does that represent? The awareness of nakedness. Well, here I think that's also used as a metaphor for embarrassment, right? Adam and Eve now have something to hide, to cover up, right? And here I think it's like a metaphor. It's not to be taken literally as, relating to perhaps an aspect of sinful sexuality. I think no. I think here this is used as a symbol of embarrassment. And why are they embarrassed? What do they have to cover up? Well, they know they sinned. They have transgressed. They have something to cover up. Up till now, they had nothing to be ashamed of. Now, after they sinned, they do have shame, and therefore they cover themselves up. They're aware of their nakedness. Okay? Now, in truth, there's not only one tree mentioned in the story, there are two. Now, if I would ask you how many trees were prohibited to man, the answer is one, right? Only one tree was prohibited, right? It's true that there were two special trees in the garden, right? But only one of them was prohibited. That is the tree of knowledge, right? Here we go. Let's say in verse 9, right? So God plants the trees, all the plants in the garden, and included in them, right, are ve'etz hachayim betoch hagan ve'etz hadat tov vara. The tree of life is in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So there are two special trees. However, as far as the commandments were concerned, only one tree was prohibited, because God says, you may eat of every tree of the garden, you may freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. Right? So only that one tree was prohibited. Now, we said that this represents the prohibition, what things that are allowed, things that are prohibited, commandments in general. But then we ask ourselves, so what's the function of the tree of life? Some commentators said that maybe there were two versions, right? Biblical critics, there are two versions of the tree, which was a special tree. And so the editor combined both. Not at all. I don't think that's correct. There were two special trees. So what's the function of the tree of life here? The answer is very simple. The tree of life, what does it represent? Immortality. It's a great metaphor for immortality. If we look at anything that's alive in nature, right, we see almost everything dies, right? Animals dies, our fish in the aquarium dies, our pets, dogs, cats die, all right? Our flowers in the garden die. But what seems to live forever? Trees, right? Healthy trees. Even if they lose their leaves in winter, they seem to regenerate and come back to life every spring, right? And some of these trees we know existed over 1,000 years. We have, right, ancient trees in Israel, ancient oak trees, and we have also, in the west coast of the United States, the famous sequoias, redwood trees that are massive and been around for some of them over 1,000 years, right? They seem to be eternal. So that's a symbol of eternity. Now, what's the logic of the tree of life within our story? It wasn't prohibited. Why not? Answer, Because we said originally man was immortal. In a theoretical sense, he was immortal. He was only punished, right, to die, to become mortal. So originally the tree was permissible. It was within man's grasp. Only after man sins, what happens? Well, then God banishes man from the Garden of Eden. How does the story conclude? So here we'll take a look at the end of chapter 3. He banishes man, right? Uh, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim and the flaming sword, which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. In other words, man loses access to the tree of life. Who guards the way to the tree of life? Well, the cherubim, angels that do have apparently immortality, right? They are within grasp of the tree of life because they are immortal. What prevents us from reaching the tree of life, eternal life? Well, the flaming sword, of course, symbols of death, right? We cannot cross that boundary. We die, right? We are mortal. All right. And if we continue forth in our interpretation, how does this story conclude? That man is driven out of the Garden of Eden. What would that parallel? What would be the significance of that? Well, man obviously loses access to the tabernacle. That would be parallel to the destruction of the temple. Mishkan, the temple, man's driven out. He becomes distant from God. Of course, there's one more aspect that we have to grapple with, and that is, well, if we want to adopt the approach that the snake is an allegory, represents the evil impulse, what shall we do with the snake's punishment? That was the question that Rasag asked. Hey, if the snake is an allegory, then his punishment must be an allegory as well. And that's what is required to be interpreted if you want to take an allegorical interpretation. So let's take a look again. What does God say? He made the snake go low on the ground. In other words, if we say evil inclination will be something low, and then take a look at what's described here in verse 15. This will be my novel interpretation for this. Be'ivashit, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. They shall strike your head, right? The descendants of the woman shall strike the head of the snake, hu yeshuvcha rosh, and you shall strike their heel. Ve'ata teshufenu akev, you will strike by the heel. In other words, the snake, indeed, how does he strike us? By from below, striking our legs, right, biting us in our legs. That is represented by the heel. And how do we overcome a snake? By striking its head. That's the way to get a snake, right? You want to kill a snake, you got to get its head. You got to, if you hold a snake by its tail, you're in trouble. It's going to turn around and get to you, right? You've got to hold it by by close to its head, neutralize its capacity to strike at you, right, or to enwrap you, and then you could bash its head. That's how we overcome a snake. So that seems to be right. Description of enmity. We have a struggle between humanity and the snake. We fight to the death, one against the other. But if we say that the snake is an allegory, what does this represent? So I want to propose, if the snake represents your evil impulses, your evil inclination, so what's described here is an eternal struggle, but not with a snake, but rather an internal struggle with your evil inclination within you. This is an internal struggle. And how does this struggle take place? How do we overcome our evil impulse? Well, you will strike by the head. In other words, only by our rationale, our rational capacities does man overcome his urges, right, and can contain them. When we strike by the head, right, when we use our rational capacities, we can overcome those evil impulses. But when it's the lower forces by the heel, represented by the heel, that have the upper hand and strike, well, then the evil impulse can have the right upper hand over us. Right? So here we can say that the punishment itself is an allegory of an ongoing struggle. And that's why God doesn't interrogate the snake. There's no separate snake. the snake here is representative of that evil inclination. It exists, and man has to struggle against his evil inclination, right? So what I'm proposing here is that the story on large is an allegory. And what is this story really discussing? What is the message of this story? I think, first of all, this is a story that discusses what is a human being. And as we can see in the story, when God tries to create a helpmate for man, it takes two attempts. Very odd, right? Description of man creating a helpmate of God creating a helpmate for man, right? The first attempt was creating animals, and that was insufficient. Man was still lonely, right? Um, uh, After the animals were brought forth, uh, man gave names to all the animals, but for Adam, there was not found a helpmate for him. He still felt lonely, right? And then only afterwards he creates the woman. What is this description of God failing in this first attempt to solve man's loneliness? Obviously, God doesn't fail, but this is meant to teach us. What is man? Answer number one, he is not an animal. He's different from an animal. Oh, so what's the alternative? If he's not an animal, the alternative is presented by the snake. What does the snake say? God knows that if you'll eat from the tree of garden, what? You will not die, but rather you will be, your eyes shall be open, you shall be like God, right? You shall be like God. Oh, so if man is not an animal, maybe he's like God. And of course, that's rejected because man is mortal, right? He's not like God. Why is he not like God? Because he sins. He succumbs to his urges, right? And so this story basically depicts man as a unique creature, different from animals, not like the positions of, you know, that of some modern scientists who describe man as simply a sophisticated ape, sophisticated animal. That's not the position of the Bible that describes man as being in the image of God. Man is different, not only quantitatively, but substantially, right? Different from animals. Therefore, he cannot find friendship with animals. He's different from the animals, right? But he's also not like an angel. He's not a god. He's something unique. Now, what the story tells us is that man has the capacity of being close to God. He was originally in the Garden of Eden, close to God's presence. But because of his succumbing to his urges, not containing them, right, then he is distanced from God, right? And paralleling the idea of the temple being destroyed. If Israel, if you will, is parallel to the Garden of Eden, if you keep the commands, then you will remain. But as we know, the warnings: if you don't, then you shall be expelled from the land, and you shall be distanced from God. So the Garden of Eden is like parallel to the Mishkan, and on a larger scale, the land of Israel, which holds the Mishkan, holds the temple. And hence this is a story with deep, right, insight into what the essence of a human being is. On the one hand, it tells us that we're different from animals. We have greater capacities, intellectual capacities, different from animals, but we still are prone to sin and succumbing to our negative and evil impulses. And that's what causes us to be distant from God and brings suffering and all the consequences, right, of sin. But it also tells us that we have the potential, because originally we were in the Garden of Eden, and hence our whole destiny and our goal is eventually to get closer once again to God, to return to the Holy Land, and once again to accomplish closeness to God. And how will this be done? With our struggle with the snake, with our evil impulse. And what is the method for overcoming the evil impulse? Well, if we view this story as an opening, the first story about man, right? This is an introduction to the rest of Torah. You want to know how to once again get close to God, to gain the privilege of being close to God and benefit from all his blessings, right? Well, then read on. This is what the Torah is all about, trying to get man once again close to God. So this is my take. Like I said, some of it originally was hinted to, the connections with the Mishkan. Some of them are already found in our sages, right? But on a whole, here, this is a quite more radical reading of the story as an allegory. So you may come back and ask me, wait a second, you're taking a very radical allegorical approach. Are there no dangers of explaining the whole Torah now allegorically? You'll do away with all the commandments, and nothing will have any actuality in its presentation, just like Rasag was wary of, and that's why he was opposed. So my answer to that concern is, well, this story itself is different from all stories. Right? We said that this story has some aspects which seem more mythological, uncharacteristic of the Bible. Because this story is different, I think that hints to us that it also has to be interpreted differently. The uniqueness of the story requires a unique interpretation. And hence my response to the concern is, it is the allegorical approach which is suitable only to this story here because of its uniqueness and aspects that seem to be totally unnatural. It's a different world, the Garden of Eden, and hence things are different and they should be interpreted differently, right? But this does not represent the typical biblical narrative, which indeed is not to be taken allegorically. Well, that's my take. If you agree with it, so be it. If you don't, you're open. I challenge you to alternative interpretations. You don't have to agree, you just have to know it. I hope you enjoyed it. Be well.